I think the most useful role I can play in the short time I have will be to try and raise some questions for the panelists as well as certainly for audience discussion. In preparing for this role, what I did was I looked back at some of the discussions that were taking place before the Olympics went to China in August 2008, and then I looked at the discussions that were taking place that were generated following what most observers, I think, would call a very successful Olympics. I look back, for example, at some of the books and articles that were written about what to expect at the Olympics. Susan's book, which I have with me, very widely cited, What the Olympics Mean to China. Some books were coming out on the political economy of the Games. How do you put on a sporting mega event and the cost of it? So a lot of stuff was coming out before the Olympics. And I think Susan, in her book, is very clear and quite accurate when she talks about the pre-Olympics reporting in the West being fixated more than anything else on whether the Olympic Games would change China. In her book, in her last chapter, for example, it's far more balanced. What she's talking about is she has the title of the last chapter is, Will the Olympics Change China, or will China change the Olympics? So there's a lot more focus on a balanced view of what having the Olympics in China actually means to the Olympic movement, because there's been relatively little reporting on the effect the Beijing Games has had on the Olympic movement and on future Olympics. It gives London, for example, a very difficult model to try and replicate. A good example, by the way, of the pre-Olympic reporting on China was the cover story in The Economist on August 2nd, 2008, which was called China's Dash for Freedom and How the Olympics Slowed It Down. It was even before the Olympics, of course. They were making their conclusions. They suggested in that long article, in that cover story, that, okay, it's true that China's a lot better off than it used to be, but, and I quote, do not expect any dramatic slide from authoritarianism as a result of the Olympics. The end of the article is suggested, and again I'm quoting, after the Olympic party, and aside, in some, they also say a dour one if security officials do not relax. After the Olympic party, many in China are likely to wonder whether it was really still worth it, and that stresses in the leadership covered up for the sake of Olympic unity may also become more apparent in the months ahead. So in a real sense, what The Economist, I'm using The Economist as an example, I can use the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, and so on. In a real sense, they were suggesting that the Olympics was going to be a mere interlude with no real lasting effects, and they were preparing for a post-Olympics analysis of China in which The Economist and other Western sources would be reporting as usual on the stresses and strains within the Chinese state and society. Now, Dan Lynch mentioned, of course, Jon Stewart in The Daily Show, and I also show The Daily Show in my large class to keep people entertained when I can. But he did satirize the obsession with the whole world watching the Olympics to try and find something wrong. He kept saying, you know, we're watching you, China. You passed the first stage. The air quality seems to be okay. And then he had various Western reporters predicting what would happen. But looking at air quality, human rights violations, underage gymnasts, lip syncing by attractive young women, and so on. So he said, okay, you passed the first stage, but we'll find something. And he said, what, we found something? And then he had the lip syncing little girl, and he pretended to be outraged. How dare you, China, how dare you do something we do every year at the Super Bowl? So, I mean, it was quite amusing, and also it was really satirizing the Western media, but also satirizing China in a way. And, of course, the Spanish basketball team and a few other things. But the Olympic Games, in the end, did register, I think, to some extent. Time magazine, when it chose the Man of the Year for 2008, I was a little bit surprised, to say the least, that number 5 on the list was Zhang Yimou. Zhang Yimou got a lot of publicity as number 5. And the article praising him was written by Steven Spielberg. To me, the reason why that's significant and is kind of an indicator of the success of the Olympics, because Spielberg was rehabilitating himself publicly after pulling out as an advisor under pressure from Mia Farrow and others, talking about if you take part in this, you're going to be part of the genocide Olympics, you're concerned about the Holocaust, how can you do this? So there's a lot of pressure on him. And the fact that Spielberg was now associating himself once again with the Olympics is probably one of the best indicators that because Spielberg, who's a trustee here, by the way, he's very aware of his image, and he's very aware, obviously, how the Olympics can help or hinder. And I doubt that Zhang Yimou would be number 5 unless Spielberg were behind this and supporting him. And you can see the prominence of Zhang Yimou and the Olympics, because in the article, it's kind of headline in the subtitle, "The filmmaker who produced the Olympic ceremonies presented an awe-inspiring vision of China to the entire world." So it's very, very positive. And if you look at the top 4 people above Zhang Yimou, a very different kind of people than Zhang Yimou. Barack Obama was number 1, Man of the Year. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson was number 2. Nicolas Sarkozy, President of France, was number 3. And our own Sarah Palin was number 4. And then you have Zhang Yimou. So he's in very interesting company there. Well, in the limited time I have, I want to focus primarily on the post-Olympics analysis, since not surprisingly, the interpretations vary widely. The International Olympic Committee called the Games an indisputable success. But I found it interesting, particularly given Susan's analysis, that the chief executive officer of the Canadian Olympic Committee felt it was especially important in addressing Western audiences to demonstrate how the Games had in fact changed China. He said it's not dramatic, at least in the short term, but it will have long-term effects. He said because of what's happened to the Games, the Chinese have had to react to influences from the outside. They've become a more open society because of the experience of the Olympics. There'll be an ongoing move toward democratization. So a lot of expectations there which might be worth discussing. Of course, human rights groups, in taking issue with the IOC evaluation, have acknowledged, okay, the Games were efficiently run, but the human rights groups have pointed to crackdowns on would-be protesters, harassment of some foreign journalists, internet censorship, and of course with most things, there are elements of truth in a lot of the varying interpretations. But now we're entering, this is kind of where I'll close, we're entering a new year, and Jay, in his comments, referred to this. We have a whole set of new challenges for China. The hope in China, presumably, was to move in a reasonably smooth way from the August Olympics to the celebration of the 60th anniversary of the founding of the PRC in October of 2009. However, even the Chinese media has instead become rather proactive in alerting local officials and the general public that China was now entering, again I quote, a peak period for mass incidents, with further warnings that a single national level event handled poorly, and they had Tibet in mind, for example, could resonate. They used a physics term, I don't know if Shanding Li is still here, he's a physicist, but they used the term gongzhen, which is a term from physics, could resonate into a threat to overall social stability and a serious political crisis. This, for example, in the issue number 1 from Outlook Weekly, Liao Wang, Xinwen Zhoukan, a very influential journal, magazine. As Jay talked about, in 2009, we have a lot of sensitive anniversaries coming up. May 4th, 1919, the origin of modern Chinese nationalism, Chinese student movement. Spring 1989, Tiananmen Square protests, military assault on June 4th. The May 1999 NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, which could produce ultranationalists. I found it interesting. I read a lot of Susan's quotes in various newspapers, and one of the things that interested me was why Michael Phelps, winning all the gold medals, was underreported in China. And Susan was quoted as saying, I don't know if it was accurate, I assume it was, that there was a fear that ultranationalists would get upset if you weren't reporting enough on Chinese winning gold medals. Why are you reporting Michael Phelps, an American? So that May 1999 issue could come up. Now we have, in the wake of Charter 08, a document released on December 10th last year, which advocates, as I read it, the elimination of one-party rule, its replacement by a democratic system that would protect human rights. It's now been signed, surprisingly, by thousands of Chinese citizens online, from ordinary people to even local officials. We've had articles, again, in places like The Economist, in the January 17th issue this year, introducing 2009, quote, as the year of living dissidently. So with the current state of the world economy, I raise this as a final question. With the current state of the world economy and Chinese exports, Chinese growth rates declining, The increasing difficulty of groups throughout Chinese society, whether university graduates or rural migrants, to find a job, it seems fair to ask, is The Economist in effect correct by implication what they're saying? Does anyone still remember the Olympics and what it brought to China, and in turn what China brought to the world? Or have the Olympics receded so far into the background as these new issues have arisen, or these enduring problems are resurfacing? They've returned. It's no longer useful to discuss the Olympics in any analysis of China's future. So I leave that as a question. Okay, thank you.